C'était un homme discret, déterminé, convaincu, compétent et chaleureux.
Always very, very active, always witty, an extraordinarily intelligent and active companion, friend.
A very kind person, a convinced pro-European, and a brilliant intellectual.
He was a senior official, a person in a position of responsibility, who showed the respect for public office and the necessary responsibility. This ethic dimension was present throughout his period as a Director General, and it was something that clearly has impressed all the people that have worked with him in the following years.
He was an excellent technocrat. He knew how to run the bureaucracy, but he was at the same time a visionary. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to determine all the steps necessary to take us to monetary union.
Never consider a defeat as something that cannot be changed into the beginning of a new process towards success for European integration.
Il est un des auteurs de l'Union économique et monétaire et de l'euro. Il a toujours considéré que, à l'agent monnaie, en quelque sorte, il fallait avoir des idées, mais les planter ailleurs que dans son propre jardin pour qu'elles prospèrent. C'est ce qui s'est passé dans le comité Delors. C'est d'ailleurs pas un hasard si Delors avait demandé à Tommaso de participer à cette aventure.
Hatte eine gewinnende Persönlichkeit. War eine überzeugende Persönlichkeit. Auf seine Sachkenntnis konnte man sich verlassen. Und war gerade als Mitglied des Direktoriums der Europäischen Zentralbank ein anerkannter Stabilitätspolitiker.
Tommaso was extremely dedicated to the team, to the collegial decisions, so he participated extremely actively in all decisions that we took in the executive board, as is the rule, of course, but with interest for absolutely all domains.
Tommaso was finance minister in Italy after his experience with the European Central Bank. He always came to the Eurogroup wearing two hats. Certainly the national hat as a representative of the Italian government, but also the hat as a member of the Eurogroup, so looking for the collective good. Full of convictions, at the same time he was ready to listen, and he was a truly consensus builder.
The idea that the European should, in advance, reinforce their governance was one of his major suggestions, and it proved, of course, particularly visionary when the crisis erupted.
Economic governance in the future will be better than the past. He would ask for more. That was his nature. He always wanted to push for more. But we should recognize that a lot has happened, and that's very much also in line with his preferences expressed a few years ago.
Ça, c'est sa vie, c'est son être, c'est l'unité de Tommaso, c'est la finance, l'économie, la monnaie, l'Europe.
Le fédéraliste convaincu n'abandonnera jamais son idéal pour agir concrètement. C'est pour ses amis un motif supplémentaire d'estime et d'admiration.
Un ami, un frère, un complice, quelqu'un avec lequel je pouvais avoir des discussions en toute franchise et qui me laissait toujours quelque chose de plus qu'au début de la conversation, ce qui n'est pas forcément courant.
Je le dis franchement, je ne trouve personne qui a l'étendue de la culture de Tommaso. Il avait tout lu, il avait réfléchi sur toutes les cultures. Nous avions des échanges incroyablement riches sur la littérature européenne, sur la littérature française, qu'il connaissait admirablement bien, De ce point de vue-là, je dois dire que j'ai énormément apprécié de pouvoir être proche de lui, l'homme de culture par excellence. Tommaso has been the best of us.
Tommaso was the best of us. That is why we were proud to have him a year and a half ago, in the middle of the crisis, to provide us with his insights. As one of the founding fathers of the euro, he knew that this was an incomplete currency from the outset, a monetary union without a political union, a common central bank without a common treasury. Instead of convergence in economic performance, it brought divergence. The construction of the United Europe has been a step-by-step, dynamic process, moving from one disequilibrium to another. As it was created, not by a single act of constitutional change like the United States, but now the current sovereign debt crisis plummets the prestige and even questions the survival of the European economic and social model. In today's uncertainty, we will attempt this evening at our Harvard Business School conference to address a few important questions, and we will even risk presenting a few answers. What will be the future of the European Union? The European Union represents globally the most advanced experiment in interstate cooperation and pooling of national sovereignty. Will it survive? How is it going to evolve? What actions are currently required for the survival of the euro? Are the December 9 European Council decisions for closer fiscal union sufficient in order to resolve the government bonds and banking liquidity crisis? Are we really running out of time? Which policies can bring growth to Europe, to the periphery, and Greece? Can the fiscal austerity alone provide Europe with sufficient growth to protect it from the higher unemployment, the lack of political consensus, and the social tensions? Does the doctrine of imposing austerity in a period of recession threatens to push the Eurozone into a vicious deflationary debt spiral from which it will be difficult to escape? Will the PSI restructuring result in a sustainable reshaping of the Greek debt so it does not have to reopen again? Will it result in creating a firewall for Europe, or will it serve as a source of contagion? Is a potential exit from the Eurozone a viable option for Greece? Which actions are required of Greece to remain in the Eurozone as an equal and meaningful partner? Our distinguished keynote speakers will try to provide insight and answer to these issues. Before we begin, on behalf of the board of the Harvard Business School Club of Greece, I would like to thank you all for being here tonight. We have quite an impressive audience. And I would like to make a few acknowledgements among our distinguished audience. Prime Minister Kostas Simitis, the ambassadors of Brazil, Germany, Netherlands, United Kingdom, United States, Ireland, the representatives of the Democratic Republic of China, Lithuania, Sweden, the ministers of the government, the members of the parliament. Special thank you for hosting our events to the chairman of the National Bank of Greece, Professor Vasilis Rapanos, and the CEO, Apostolos Tamvakakis. Our first speaker is someone that does not need introduction in the Greek audience. He has been here before, one of the most influential German economists, advisor to President Delors, whose brainchild is the European Stability Fund. As my friend, the Nobel laureate Robert Mandel says, Daniel has been my best student. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Gros.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here again. I still remember an event about 1 year ago when I had the occasion to present some of my views on what the problem was in Greece, which were a bit different from those of the perceived wisdom. I'm asking whether I shouldn't talk from my seat. That might be... Okay. Everything's off. I'm off. Okay, we'll try. So since I had already the occasion and the pleasure to talk about Greece last time, what I wanted to do today is to speak about two different crises. A European crisis and a regional crisis in Greece. And I wanted to bring out what the key issues are in both cases. Now let me start with the broader euro area crisis, which has been brought to the forefront of our attention again by the downgrading that Standard & Poor's did over the last days. For the United States, for the United Kingdom, and close to that Japan. The debt level is also not that high, it's around 80-ish, whereas again for the US and UK you're approaching 100%. So I think the attention that has been focused on the fiscal aspects has been overdone. And I think Jean will talk later about the futility of the fiscal compact. But we have to add to this moderate fiscal problem a second one which is even more important, which is that the euro area as such has a balanced current account. This means that there are enough resources within the euro area to deal with the fiscal deficits that we have. So what is really the cause of the problem in the euro area? It's not the overall level of either deficit or the debt, but the distribution of the available funding within. And that, I think, was also highlighted by Standard & Poor's. The basic issue is quite simple. We have an excess of savings in Germany, Austria, and other countries, basically every country north of the Alps. And we have deficit basically in every euro area country south of the Alps. Until 1 or 2 years ago, capital flew very willingly, private capital flew very willingly from the north to the south, and people were quite happy and thought it could go on forever. But somehow after 2008, the music changed. Not so much the broad facts, but the view people took of the facts. Until then it was thought, okay, we lent a lot of money to Southern Europe, but these guys are growing relatively rapidly, so it's not a big problem. Their debt to GDP ratios are manageable. 2 years ago, the music changed. Not so much the broad facts, but the view people took of the facts. Until then it was thought, okay, we lent a lot of money to Southern Europe, but these guys are growing relatively rapidly, so it's not a big problem. Their debt to GDP ratios are manageable. Now, with the crisis, the point of view has changed. Now people in Northern Europe think, oh, they have such a high debt level, how will they ever be able to repay it? How will they ever be able to service their debt? And they basically stop investing in the South. So you have hundreds of little risk committees in Germany, Holland, and other countries, where not speculators, but investment funds, banks, insurance companies, these people sit together and say, okay, we have all these funds, what do we do with them? And whenever somebody says Italy, the risk manager says, risk. Don't get caught with Italy on your balance sheet, because then you will look stupid at the end of the year. So maybe for partially also just these psychological reasons, what's happening is that the North no longer invests or sends the funding to the South. And when that happens, economists call that a sudden stop, then basically there's no longer an equilibrium in financial markets. Italy might not have a very large deficit, but it has to roll over about 10% of its GDP in old debt coming due. And if the German, Dutch, and other Northern European savers just say, okay, I'm glad I have my money back, but I won't reinvest it, then Italy has a problem. So what can be done under these circumstances? How can you transfer Northern European savings to Southern Europe? Now, it is being done, partially at least, already now, by the European Central Bank. They are so to speak, creating a big tunnel under the Alps, and through this tunnel, they can basically provide at least some of the funding from north to south. And they don't do that in the first instance by buying themselves Italian, Spanish bonds, but they do that because German, Dutch, and other banks deposit a lot of funds with the ECB, and the ECB then on-lends these funds in Southern Europe. So basically, the ECB has become the central counterparty for the banking system in Europe. German banks no longer lend directly to Italian banks, but at least they're doing it indirectly via the ECB. So you might say, okay, very good, that's a solution. The problem is that this is not a fully fledged solution. It can prevent a collapse of the banking system because it provides at least a minimum transfer, but you cannot imagine the ECB basically substituting for the entire amount of private cross-border lending which has been going on in the euro area. That would just make the balance sheet of the ECB explode, and of course would raise big concerns in Germany about the risks the ECB is taking. Let me make one parenthesis which is very important. In Germany, of course, people say, okay, when the balance sheet of the ECB expands, that's bad because we'll have inflation. I think that's not at all the case at present, at least, because all the ECB is doing, it's taking excess funding from Northern Europe and bringing it to Southern Europe. There's no additional purchasing power being created, so there can be no inflation. The question is not about inflation, but the question is, of course, the counterparty risk the ECB is taking. And it wasn't really designed to do that. So is there a way out? At least in the short run, we have to rely on the ECB. But in the longer run, I can see basically only one way in which this problem could be solved, at least solely, and that is when, over time, at least, Southern Europe gets into external balance, so they don't need anymore a flow of Northern European savings. So then that would mean for the euro area, probably still have continuing surpluses in Northern Europe, and in Southern Europe would then go from deficits to balance. Mathematically, the result is quite clear. Then you would have the euro area in surplus. And that, of course, can come about only if the euro depreciates. So my conclusion would be quite simple. If you want to save the euro in the long run, probably you have to accept a weak euro. But to put another way, a Europe that is weak externally is the only Europe which I can imagine which is also strong internally. That's the only way I can see the current euro area problem be resolved, at least in the medium run. How do we get there? Again, that is clear. As long as Northern European savers don't regain their trust in Southern Europe, the only institution which can help us is the European Central Bank. And you can see the policy conclusion which follow from that. What we need is not so much a stability pact or more limits on fiscal deficits. I believe they will come anyway because Italy, Spain, and other countries have learned the lesson and will do everything they can to diminish their deficit and debt levels. But they need some time to do that, and they need some time to adjust their external accounts, and I think only the ECB can provide that time. So that is the euro area crisis. The crisis basically of an internal disequilibrium and lack of trust between two parts of the area. If I look at Greece, however, the situation is completely different. Here, you have exactly that what you don't have at the euro area. Namely, you have high fiscal deficits, very high debt levels accumulated from the past, and you have a very large current account deficit. So meaning the country as such doesn't have enough resources to finance its own consumption. It doesn't really matter so much whether that consumption is financed in the first instance by the government who gives the money to the people who then consume, or whether people consume it directly. The key point is that one should always look at the country as government and people together. And the balance of the country as such you see in the current account. And that is something the country cannot determine itself in the sense that as long as financial markets are very positive, as they were until 2008, and financial market conditions are very easy, you can finance, as we have seen, very large current account deficits for a very long time. We have also seen that the music can change. That suddenly people can say, for us, Greece is a risk, we don't lend anymore. Yes, this is called sudden stop, and they happen. Now, when a country has its own currency, usually what happens is the currency collapses until it becomes so cheap that the foreigners say, at this price, maybe it's worthwhile to go back in. And the required rate of depreciation can be pretty large. I remember still the case of Italy between 1992 and 1995, when the Italian lira basically against the D-mark then depreciated by 100% or 50%. The lira basically doubled. And that was for a country which had only relatively small external deficit and a manageable deficit. So the required depreciation can be very large and can overshoot. The other approach is what is called internal devaluation, and that means that you have to have some collective action whereby you mimic the same effect by basically reducing domestic prices and wages. The most prominent example that we have had in the European Union was Latvia. Latvia had an actually even larger current account deficit than Greece when it started, it was 20% of GDP. And basically in the space of 2 months, that was turned into a surplus. This was not done through a miracle increase in exports because they always take time. It was basically done through a brutal compression of domestic demand. Basically, consumption was reduced by over 20% of GDP. Investment also fell, so that's how the resources were liberated to turn the current account around. And these are really the two choices a country faces when it starts with an external deficit to start with. And I think these are basically also the choices facing Greece. Either the reduction in domestic consumption absorption is achieved via collective agreement, which will of course require fiscal retrenchment, But in the end, it will always also require a reduction in nominal wages throughout the entire private sector. How that is achieved will vary from country to country. Sometimes you have to cut minimum wages, sometimes you have to cut overtime, sometimes the 14th or 15th salary, or the details always matter, are different from country to country. But the result in the end.
It's part of the excitement of the presentation. Is it possible to fix it finally?
Okay, perhaps I try again. Much better now. Okay. Slowly. Not to keep too much about cutting wages. So these are only the two choices. Now the problem is, and that we also see from country after country, that if you want to achieve it through a collective agreement, then you have to have a society, a polity which works. Polity in which the burden of adjustment can be distributed in such a way that it's perceived to be fair. Now the perception of what is fair, again, will vary from country to country. But in the end, you measure the strength of a society by the ability in a time of crisis to pull together and to achieve such an agreement. And that is ultimately the political test which I think Greece is facing. And that is the political test that Europe is expecting. What Europe is expecting is a country that can live up to its promises. And for Europe, meaning Brussels and now Berlin in the first instance, it doesn't really matter so much what is going on within Greece, what is just or not just. What the outsiders want to see is a country that works and that can live up to its promises. And I think that is the challenge that is still open. Not all is lost. It can still be done, but it's really getting, say, 5 or 2 minutes before midnight, because the fiscal adjustment has been started and one sees some first results, but the real adjustment on the private sector side, on the reduction in costs, which will only way to make the Greek economy again competitive in the short run, that has barely started. And I think that is the key element which is still missing. If that came together now, then I think together with the PSI, the Greek economy could become sustainable again. But one without the other, I would say it doesn't make sense. Let me stop here.
Our next speaker was the advisor to the French Prime Minister, one of the most important French and European economists, an acute observer of the European Union Fiscal Union, a prolific writer whose recent book, Le Réveil des Démons, should be on everyone's master list of books. Most probably will translate it into Greek. Jean Pisani-Ferry.
Thank you. Let me try from here, just for the sake of an experiment in microphones. I don't have any disagreement with what Daniel just said about the analysis of the euro crisis. I think this balance of payment angle is the right one to approach at least the important dimensions of the euro crisis. Let me just add that what we are seeing at present is supervisors, regulators in Northern Europe preventing banks from channeling savings to Southern Europe, which is a kind of self-defeating strategy, because it then leads the financing to go through the euro system and through the build-up of balances through the so-called Target 2 system, which create additional difficulties because of the increasing reluctance on the part of Northern Europe to accept this kind of transfer through the euro system, although the central bank is just doing its job. So it's a dimension, I think, that we should emphasize. But the question I wanted to ask is, why is it that we are having a strategy that looks to be so different, that put the emphasis on the fiscal side, and how we can assess this strategy and possibly how we can amend this strategy. The decisions on the 9th of December, after the six-pack that was just before adopted by the EU, which also emphasized the fiscal dimension, puts all the emphasis there. Together with the ECB provision of liquidity to bank, we can say the response is liquidity to banks on the part of the ECB and fiscal retrenchment enforced through European rules. Why? Why is it so, if we agree that the problem is at least in part of a different nature? I think the implicit assumptions behind this strategy, beyond the domestic politics in Northern Europe, is also that forcing a fiscal adjustment and keeping countries in difficulties under the pressure of markets is the only way to ensure that those countries are going to implement adjustment and reform. So that, in a way, this pressure, the recession, are part of the solution. And there was an episode, a very interesting episode, this last summer, which strongly reinforced this perception. When the ECB started buying Italian bonds, after a letter had been sent to the Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi by Jean-Claude Trichet and Mario Draghi, then at the Bank of Italy, emphasizing the program of reforms that had to be implemented in Italy. And after the Italian government had given its consent, so the ECB started buying bonds. And a few days after, the Italian coalition backtracked on the tax reform commitments. And it was very much perceived as the indication that the very support that was given to Italy by the ECB was weakening the incentive to reform and to adjustment. Now, this was corrected thereafter, but the perception is there in Northern Europe that only the suffering, only the harsh times will push countries which haven't implemented reforms over the last 10 years or even more, but certainly over the last 10 years of EMU, will only through this pressure they will deliver those reforms and this adjustment. In a way, the recession is a price to pay for salvation. So what's wrong with this strategy? I think, as I said, it has a certain validity. It's indisputable that reforms are in short supply. It's indisputable that they are resisted, that there are deep political economy reasons why you have, public finances in a precarious state, why you have reforms that are not being implemented. And so there is a certain validity to the idea that you have to push to in this direction through keeping countries in a precarious situation. Now, there are two difficulties there. One is simply that you have a certain fallacy of composition in this approach. Italy plus Spain plus France plus the countries already under IMF EU programs, they represent more than 50% of the GDP of the euro area. If all those countries at the same time find themselves in this kind of situation, in all those countries experience recession, it's a different situation than the situation when you have one country suffering the pain in an environment in which this environment is supporting, and if the country introduces the right measures, it will recover and benefit from this growing environment outside. So here, what I'm afraid of is that the prime ministers who are implementing those reforms will not be able to deliver, to demonstrate to their fellow citizens that those reforms pay off because of the environment of no growth or slow growth in the euro area as a whole. That's the number one problem I would mention. The second problem I would mention is that, again, I mean, there are dimensions of inherent weaknesses of the euro area that have nothing to do with the fiscal adjustment and that are of a systemic nature. So Daniel emphasized this current account dimension. Let me also point out another weakness, which is that we have a system in the euro area in which we're saying each country is responsible for its own debt. So this is no co-responsibility principle. Some people would call it the no bailout clause. It's the provision in the treaty. At the same time, you're saying there will be no monetary financing of states, of governments. So the central bank doesn't act as a lender of last resort to government. And third, you have a situation in which banks, governments are responsible for rescuing banks, and banks are holding large amounts of government bonds. If you take all these three dimensions together, they create a vulnerability because, and you have seen that in this crisis, you have seen in some countries a state weakening and then the banks suffering from that. Or in some other countries like Ireland, you have seen the banks hit by the imprudent lending, and then the government hit by the consequences of the situation of banks. And in this situation, the government, the state cannot count on the central bank. It cannot count on the other states. And so there is an inherent weakness there. And this is not being addressed. And on the contrary, to an extent, what Daniel just said is that, in effect, if we're saying the solution to this problem is that Italian savers hold Italian bonds, it means you're strengthening, in fact, this bilateral relationship between government and banks. And in fact, this is what we're seeing in this crisis, that non-residents are selling bonds, and banks hold more and more of their own, the share, the bonds of their own government, which is a weakness and which is one of the problems we're having in this country and one of the dimensions of the PSI discussion. So you could say by just implementing fiscal adjustment, you will get rid of the problem because we will end up in a situation where the debt is so low that this weakness will vanish. The problem is that this level of debt may be very low, maybe below 60%. Nothing tells us that 60% is a safe level. Ireland had a 25 debt to GDP level in 2007. Spain had a 40% debt to GDP level in 2007. So there's nothing that tells us that 60% is safe. And if we're saying that you have to go significantly below 60%, how long is it going to take, even with a very, very sustained adjustment? Is it a strategy that will keep us in a weak situation for the next 10 or 20 years or more? But I think this brings back the discussion on what are the systemic solutions. a different role for the ECB. I don't think, and we could go back to that in the discussion, I don't think it is very likely or very feasible. A regulatory reform that would reduce the concentration of government bonds in the portfolios of banks, I think that governments will just go the opposite direction. They will tend, because they have to issue their bonds, they have to find buyers for the bonds, they will tend to make sure that the banks located on their territory, they're buying much of these bonds. And the famous Eurobonds, which may in the end be one promising avenue to solve this problem. This is the core, whatever the solution, this is the core of the issue. So instead, I would say, of concentrating on the fiscal side, it might be good to address those dimensions. And if you read the Standard & Poor's communique of last Friday, what does it say? It says that this approach to the solution to the European crisis is based on a very partial reading of the nature of the crisis. And it essentially amounts to a vote of no confidence on the decisions taken in December. And it's a whole, in fact, each country put emphasis on the downgrade, on its downgrade, or the French downgrade, because it's this parity between France and Germany was symbolically broken. But more than that, it's a vote on the strength, the solidity of the euro area as a whole, and I think we should listen to this message. So, what can be done to conclude? One is really that we're missing, and you mentioned that in the introduction, we're missing the Gros dimension, the Gros program for the euro area as a whole. There is no magic solution to this problem, but there are a number of things that can be done. Target efforts, not outcomes in budgetary terms. So say how much you have to adjust every year, but do not pretend that you're going to reach a certain deficit that depends on the economic situation. Work on the composition of the fiscal adjustments. Too much of the fiscal adjustments that have been introduced in a hurry since September rely on just increasing taxes instead of either reforming taxes or cutting spending selectively in a way that is not harmful to growth. Make room and work on relative price adjustments. That goes back to what Daniel was saying about Greece, how to adjust the real exchange rate to make the economies that are less competitive or uncompetitive competitive again. Repair the banking system, because part of the problem we're having has to do with a credit crunch that part of Europe is suffering from. Use better the EU instrument, the structural fund, and this starts being done here, but also the EU budget more generally, which is not used in a way that is very conducive to growth. I mean, after all, the EU budget is a significant, it represents a significant amount of money, if only in absolute terms. Accept the reality that there needs to be sectoral policies, because when relative prices are wrong, capital is not going to go to the traded goods sector if there are no incentives to go to the traded goods sector, because the traded goods sector is simply uncompetitive. So all that has to be put together in a credible program for growth, and we're lacking that at present, and I think that's a question of where you're putting your political energy into that, or only on the fiscal front. Now, the other part is the repair of the euro system that I was mentioning, and again we can go back to it with the components of fiscal, the banking, and the political union that goes with it, because you can't contemplate any closer fiscal union without an entity that has a political legitimacy to exercise the closer control that is needed. I mean, there can't be Eurobonds without ex-ante control of a budget, and there can't be ex-ante control of a budget without an entity that has the legitimacy to do so. So I would say all that is what I would wish the leaders to contemplate. And since we are paying tribute to Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa today, I would like to end with a sentence he wrote in his last book, which I'm going to translate from the French because this is the language in which I read this book. And I think this is very profound and illustrate what was said about him. He said, there is a view in Europe that power should be weak, that you shouldn't give too much power to the EU. And he said the weak power and the limited power are two different things. A weak power is a power that has responsibility, competences, but doesn't have the instrument to exercise these responsibilities. And so the weak power is a power that cannot reach its goals, its aims, for the lack of instruments. A limited power is a power that has limited competences, limited aims, limited scope. And he said, power should be limited. You may wish to limit, the degree of the responsibilities you are assigning to the European level in that case. But when you're assigning responsibility, you should give all the instruments that allow the power to reach its aims. Otherwise, a weak power is something that, by definition, cannot succeed. And his conclusion that weak power leads to despotism. I think that's a profound approach to the issues we're discussing tonight, and I wanted just to mention it in concluding.
Our next speaker is an international statesman with a unique experience and perspective on globalization. He ran the United Nations with efficiency and brought substantial results. The sharp thinker whose insights are most relevant for Europe's path towards supranational democracy, the de facto Foreign Minister of Europe, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown.
Forgive me for speaking again from this podium, but Stelios, I think, felt with that introduction, fraudulent though it was, I should, but I think he also wanted to find out whether there's a technician in the room who's anti-German. So we'll now have the test. Let me just start with a word of thank you to Stelios, who I have known in the United States over many years as somebody who is an unofficial ambassador for Greece to both financial and from Greece to both financial and policy circles in New York and Washington. And it's remarkable to see that he's brought that ability to assemble extraordinary people together in a room back with him to Athens. And I must say, I don't think at even his largest parties in New York he got quite such a turnout as he has here. So thank you, Stelios, very much. Listening to these extraordinarily powerful presentations from two of Europe's most distinguished economists, I was reminded again that I have had this great good fortune to have lived through more financial crises around the world than most have through a career both in political advice to governments, many of whom went through financial crisis. I hope nothing to do with my advice. They just did, and it's why they hired me. To then being at the World Bank and subsequently at the United Nations, and then in Gordon Brown's cabinet when he assembled the G20 in London at the height of the first round of all this in 2008. And throughout that lucky accidental pedigree in financial crisis management, I was enabled and liberated by one thing above all else. I don't have a PhD in economics. Now, there is a serious point to this, because it has allowed me to look at these crises through what I am trained in, which is politics. And I believe very profoundly that successful management of financial crises requires strong political leaders to impose a narrative on the events unfolding. I think Jean's description of the very different numbers which suddenly become the orthodoxy as a trigger for crisis goes to the heart of this. It is possible for political leaders, if they are demonstrating strength, coherence, vision and direction, to redefine for markets what is the threshold of crisis. And let me just give you one example of this from the period of 2008. I was well known to quite a few Asian leaders as having been a World Bank vice president at the time of the Asian financial crisis in 1997. I find myself back in Asia as Gordon Brown's envoy, trying to raise resources for the emergency package we assembled for the London summit, $1 trillion that we allegedly put up to stabilize the markets. And many an Asian leader took me aside as I sort of made my road trip round Asia, trying to drum up funds, and observed to me that in 1997 I had been one of many Western officials who'd been preaching austerity, fiscal reduction to those governments of Asia, and now suddenly I was back with what looked to them like a very similar crisis, preaching that this time the way out of it was to sustain spending in the economies of Europe. And at its heart, their point was valid. In the case of 2008, dominant political leaders, the leadership of Europe, backed by the US, where the crisis was as profound, embarked on a fiscal stimulus. In 1997, those same governments, not themselves sitting in the center of that financial crisis, but instead offering advice from the sidelines and being the ones required to provide financial support, preached to the much weaker, much more confused, less certain semi-democratic leaderships of Asia that the only way out of this was dramatic contraction. So I've seen how where you sit, the political power and voice available to you, the confidence of your argument are absolutely decisive in determining how crises are handled. So I want to turn as a rank outsider to the situation of Greece and approach it, as I say, as a political commentator and observer. And the most striking thing to me is that you have all allowed this to become a crisis of whether you should be members of the euro, not of whether you should be members of Europe. And what I mean by that is the euro, despite its huge importance, and I am not denigrating that for a moment, has become, for the youth, not just of Greece and for those who have been out in the squares demonstrating, but for young people in my country, Britain, or indeed much of Europe, a deeply discredited currency in political terms, because it is seen as the currency which has been brought into disrepute by financial and political elites that have not served their people well, and that they are the groups whose bailout of the euro will now be served by its rescue. And this has completely obscured the much more fundamental issue of the Europe that so many people in this room fought for Greece's membership of, but more broadly fought for as the enlightened, open Europe where men and women, young men and women of a range of countries had the opportunity for a democratic, integrated vision of their future, which gave them not just opportunity and vision and purpose and depth and dimension to their lives as citizens of that Europe, but gave Europe a place on the world stage. And as we get reduced to this debate about in or out of the euro, that much broader vision of Europe has gotten lost. And, it seems to me that for politicians here in Greece, as in much of the rest of the continent, that must be restored as the critical starting point of a narrative. This was an experiment in social democracy which accepted that countries of very different stages of development and economic per capita income could live together within a coherent set of political structures of 2008. A very unlikely man, Gordon Brown, a prime minister who never succeeded in establishing his authority domestically, was able, as the host of that 2008 summit in London, to briefly bring together not just Europe, but the whole of the G20 around a common vision of staring down the markets, of putting the resources in place to get through that period of crisis. Now, he didn't find a solution to the structural problems that have flared up again and gotten us to where we are today. And, rhetoric and not blinking when you are in the eyes of a market storm gets you so far. Without the kinds of reforms that have been discussed tonight, you're never going to solve the fundamental problem. But that absence of leadership today is absolutely telling. Because, when we got to Brussels at the end of last year, certainly the British government did itself no favours by what happened in the middle of the night in Brussels vis-à-vis a future more coherent Europe from a financial governance point of view. But nor did other government leaders. Europe is a Europe of many stakeholders and many institutions. It is the most sophisticated, complex international watch mechanism of international institutions that has been created so far, much more complex than the United Nations, with which I'm much more familiar. But at the end of the day, like any polity anywhere, it responds to and must be driven by leadership. That leadership, in turn, in Europe must come from a compelling, persuasive case which galvanizes a coherent, integrated European political response. And Greece must become part of the argument for that again. It must break away from appearing to hang on to Europe by its fingertips, trying to make that extra cut to stay just in and not just out of the euro. The financial cuts to get there and the debate about that, as I say, are absolutely key. But they must not be at the expense of that bigger political case and vision for why Europe for Greece, and what Europe must do as a political entity to restore and repair and regroup itself. Thank you very much.
Before we move to the next segment of our presentation, which is the issues about Greece, I would like to ask one question to the three previous speakers on Europe, starting from Daniel Gros, but you can all debate on this. What will bring growth in the periphery in Europe and in Europe while we're having austerity measures in the core of Europe? And do you believe, as you wrote in your last paper, Daniel, that it's essential to have a devaluation of the euro versus the dollar?
Thank you, Stelios. On the first part, I think I mentioned earlier, I can't see a way out of the crisis really without a much weaker euro. But if I'm realistic on the first part of the question, I would say there's nothing much really one can do. I know it sounds defeatist, but one has to be realistic. Over the last decade or so, growth in Southern Europe existed in terms of GDP, went up. But if you look at what kind of GDP went up, you see it was mostly related either to construction in Spain or consumption related in Greece. The investment rate in Southern Europe were actually higher than in Germany, for example. So it was not the amount of capital which was missing, but the allocation of capital, which went to the wrong sectors. Unfortunately, the capital is there and can't be really transferred easily. And this is true both of the physical capital. If you have nice showrooms in downtown Athens, they're much useful for, maybe for some tourists, yes, okay, but otherwise not much useful to build machines for export. And even more for the human capital. You cannot make skilled manufacturing workers out of people who sold things to each other or did other non-tradable jobs at home. And the fact that this is so difficult, you can actually see with one experiment which we have had and which many people forget. And I think it's really crucial to understand. What Spain, Greece, and Portugal are going through today is actually exactly what Germany had to do between 1995 and 2005. In 1995, Germany had unification boom, huge fiscal deficit, a large current account deficit, and then when the boom stopped, basically it had then 10 years to do the adjustment. And the point is, it was 10 years it took Germany between 1995 and 2005, during which Germany was considered as the weak link in Europe. Right? What can we do to get more growth in Germany? Right? Endless discussions about the German economy was not competitive enough. The wages in Germany were twice as high as somewhere else, and endless. And people were saying, with monetary union, Germany can never get back. It did get back, but it took a very long time to get the people back in the manufacturing sector to produce exports. And therefore, I think if you're realistic, we have to wait for this very long period.
After your statement, your microphone will start malfunctioning again. Jean.
I will try to be a little bit less pessimistic than Daniel, and it's relatively easy. I don't dispute the fact that it takes time. I don't dispute the fact that a period of adjustment and recession is unavoidable. But I would just take the example of Ireland. Ireland had massive distortions with the construction sector having grown to perhaps 3 times the normal size, with a massive stock of housing that was above anything reasonable, and was based on the assumption that there would be permanent inflow of new immigrants and all the kind of crazy assumption you're making in a construction boom. Now, Ireland is adjusting. The reason why Ireland is adjusting and is recovering in terms of export competitiveness is that Ireland is a very open economy in which people understand what is the implication of adjusting your costs, adjusting your wages, adjusting your prices, and where it pays off relatively fast. I'm not saying Greece is in the situation of Ireland. Greece is much more of a closed economy. It's also a small economy, but it's a closed economy compared to Ireland. So it's more difficult in Greece. But it is being done in Ireland, and it has started paying off. So there is a way.
Minister Giannitsis would like to add something.
I would like to remind that we have one factor which perhaps was not possible for Germany to benefit from, but theoretically and practically it is possible to consider this in the case of Greece. And this is the resources, the available resources, the structural funds from the structural funds of the European Union, which now are at a rather low level, not available, used, And there is a good an ample room, let's say, to use them for investments. And what kind of investments, of course, is something one has to discuss, but they could be mobilized much more and much more targeted to enhance investment and growth in this period in Greece. And this could facilitate, would not create a paradise, but could facilitate the exit of the crisis.
Now we are entering the section on Greece. The next speaker is the articulate voice of the Greek private sector, the method builder of national consensus and labor relations, the outspoken proponent of growth for Greece, Dimitris Daskalopoulos.
Stelios, you said we're entering the discussion about Greece, but I will not, either in the beginning or in the end of my intervention, avoid talking about Greece within Europe, because Greece is Europe, and I cannot imagine either Europe or Greece without each other. And I should note, I will come back to this at the end, that it is the first time in the European experiment in 30 or 40 years, at least in my view, that we have gone away from a common dream and looking for the next step and holding each other's arms to achieve the next achievement. And we're in a period in the last 2 years where we talk about countries, differences of countries, traits of people. We are bringing up nationalistic stereotypes that have come to the point of becoming, offensive anecdotes also, one about the other. In our leadership levels, we are pointing fingers at each other. We are happy when we are able to push a country to change a government or a prime minister to leave. And I don't know if all this bodes well for the future of Europe. And I would say that the problem of Europe started in Greece, or manifested itself in a big way in Greece initially, but the fact that it has become a poison pill for all of Europe and for the world economy as well, I think is a reflection, a symptom of the deeper institutional problems that are faced by the Union today and that were latent, sitting there. Of course, the Greek crisis highlighted the weaknesses of the euro as a sovereign currency and as a reserve currency, but even more importantly, it has questioned the solidarity of Europe and the future of Europe as a political entity, as a union of nations, as a union of people. In Greece itself, the political implications are nothing short of radical. The very political system that brought Greece to this crisis because of the way it used the state in a clientelistic way and with overspending, this same system is now called upon to change things, to sever the ties with its clients, and to reduce the size and the intervention of the state in the economy. No wonder that the reforms have been postponed, undermined, targets are being repeatedly missed, and politicians seem sort of content to watch the unfolding of this drama, even still today thinking more of catering to voters and worrying about being re-elected. There are two reasons for that, beyond the obvious that this political system and the Greek state have so been closely intertwined for so many decades. Today, there's also an unspoken but well-spread belief that the EU will not allow Greece to go under. And second, there is somewhere in our whole system, an alliance, a part of an alliance of political parties, trade unions, state employers, that would rather even reign over a small and exhausted country than lose their benefits and power. The government that we have put in place now does represent a real effort to implement a viable exit strategy. And more importantly, we noted that the political parties had no option but to support it. It was imposed by public opinion because the alternative would have been an official default. Its success, however, we see today would essentially undermine the existing political parties by showing that there can be an effective solution to deal with a crisis, one that is beyond traditional political thinking and traditional governmental practices. So the mandate to the Papadimos government was very restrictive: negotiate the PSI, do whatever you can to get the new loan, and go home. The sooner the better. Because the general election would then allow the political system to survive, perhaps through a new set of balances, but with the state still at the service of politics. But in the meantime, Greece is still deep in the woods. There are two critical issues at stake. First, the success of the PSI is by no means guaranteed. Secondly, even under the assumption that all goes well and the new loan agreement is signed, Greece would still have to implement a harsh austerity regime, or a harsh change regime, which is more important. And prime among these changes is the ability to achieve primary surplus. And the political system has purposely glossed over the fact that the national choice comes exactly down to this. Either a primary surplus is achieved permanently and predominantly through the reduction of public expenditure, or the country faces the visible nightmare of return to the drachma. Our partners have also made it clear, our EU partners and lenders have made it clear that from now on they will finance only our existing external debt. And it is up to us to stop adding to this. From now on, any primary deficit will have to be financed by domestic savings. If this fails, then there's, theoretically, the economists will say, no alternative but to print money, and Greece cannot print euros. Theoretically, still, to some minds, it can print drachmas, but this is a scenario out of hell. It cannot be dismissed, though, and that's why we're all wary here in Greece, because we need to have permanent fiscal discipline, the commitment of major political parties, the mobilization of all of society to work together, and we have not been great at this. And within the moral context of Greek politics, a divergence from agreed obligations cannot be ruled out. It keeps happening. But there is no room for any more divergence now. Now is the time when the question, does Greece want Europe and does Europe want Greece? This is the time that this question will be resolved once and for all. The only way to avoid the destructive scenario of the official default is for the present government to be given the leeway and the support to set the economy and the country on a road that does not allow a return to the old habits. Our society has shown remarkable resilience to the harsh effects of the crisis and is ready to go along with the fundamental changes in institutions, in practices that the political system has not dared to push forward. The creative and progressive forces of our society are, although silent, are alive and they are ready to pursue and guarantee a better future. Things are at their most critical juncture, but the dynamic and creative forces of the private sector are alive and well. Business leaders can and should collaborate with the creative forces in this society, the thoughtful academicians, the intelligent technocrats, the politicians who are willing to go against the grain in order to mobilize this large silent majority of the Greek people who want to stay in Europe. And this alliance has the potential to resist to those who resist change. Let me close with one overall observation. This crisis is having and will have a fundamental impact on both Greece and Europe. Both find themselves at a critically historic time. It is now vital that as Europeans, together, we think with vision and act with resolve. As of now, we seem to be addressing numbers and markets, not people. But the deeper issue is people. The Union was founded on the solemn promise of greater prosperity and more social benefits for its citizens. Instead, today, citizens all over Europe are faced with a harsh reality of indebtedness and austerity, without even a tangible promise of exit. The much-touted European social security system is threatened and looks unsustainable. And unemployment has devastated millions and is threatening millions more. I think the choice for the EU is clear. It will either move forcefully towards the creation of a full economic and political union, or the Euro project will fail, and the Union itself will face a deep, destructive, potentially existential crisis. Europe will either re-engage its citizens in the next phase of the European dream, or lose their support even for what we have today as Europe. And the choice for Greece, of course, is equally clear. It will either transform itself into a truly European country in terms of institutions, practices, and the rule of law, or it will find itself back into poverty and marginalized by the international community.
Our next speaker is one of the most respected politicians of Greece in our generation. A prophet before his time, the tireless reformer is more than ever indispensable in this crucial period. Please welcome Professor Minister Tassos Giannitsis.
Thank you, Stelios. I would like to thank the Harvard Business School Club of Greece and particularly you for inviting me at this very distinguished Padua Skiopa annual conference. I will concentrate on two issues. First issue, what are the policy questions and what is at stake today? Second issue, what are the government goals and how success can be ensured? On the first question, questions and what is at stake. Last November, and under dramatic conditions, the present government was assigned the responsibilities to complete the European Summit decisions of October, that is the PSI, the new midterm program, the 130 billion euro loan agreement, to vote a credible budget for 2012, and also to push forward the fiscal and structural measures agreed under the 2010 memorandum. However, all these issues are only partial aspects of a more fundamental question: how to avoid the default, which would lead the Greek society back to very painful social and political realities, would destroy many national dreams, would hurt national self-confidence as well as social and political stability, and finally would open the door for many socially irresponsible, disastrous, and anti-European forces and ideas. Briefly, what was and still is at stake is the whole reality of our society and not just some economic questions. I would add that this government has also another task: to give our society a credible alternative and the conviction that adjustment and appropriate changes, as well as the abandonment of fatal obsessions, can secure a positive perspective. Today, the Greek society is frustrated. It has lost confidence on policy and cannot really understand whether successive restrictive policies could guarantee success, and this has to change. Most of the policy approaches, both in Greece and in the Eurozone, during the crisis were just to gain time. In both cases, we saw that policy was too slow, too late. Inevitably, it proved to be a wrong strategy. Moreover, each time the problems became more difficult, the markets were ahead of policy, and the cost to deal with a new situation kept mounting higher and higher. In fact, our political and governance system is based on beliefs and approaches which systematically fail to generate appropriate decisions and block the road to a post-crisis landscape. To put it more clearly, my view is that behind the economic crisis, we are faced with a governance system in crisis, and that to deal with the economic crisis, we need desperately to overcome the failure of policy. This government could gain a significant bet if it could complete its tasks successfully and consequently become a paradigm of success. Such a result would prove that even under extremely adverse conditions and within a few months, a non-typical government could restore social confidence and some optimism and offer a better starting point to the next government. On the second issue, the government goals and how success can be ensured. The situation we are faced with is not just an economic dysfunction. To exit the crisis, we need to remove some fundamental hindrances, such as, first, the attitude that we could solve our problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. Second, the embedded conservatism of our political system and of influential parts of our society against structural change and transformation, as well as the disastrous convictions that national wealth can be based on an exponentially increasing dependency on deficits and debts. Third, the lack of confidence of our European partners with regard to our willingness to act, the lack of confidence of our society in regard to the pertinence of the national and European anti-crisis policies, the lack of confidence of investors on our perspectives. And finally, the difficulty to develop policies which can tackle the most crucial determinants of a crisis. I will emphasize within this framework three necessary policy issues: consolidation plus growth, reforms and competitiveness. On consolidation and growth, in view of the reality we are living in, the government has to succeed on two basic policy areas. It has to achieve an effective consolidation and accelerate the road to positive growth rates. In brief, we have to be decisive in restoring our macroeconomic imbalances. Last year, our public expenses and receipts, as well as the deficit, remained unchanged in comparison to 2010. Despite substantial additional social costs, reduced incomes and increased taxes, the result was none changed. Something went wrong. Fiscal deficits and debt have to be substantially reduced, and a rebalancing is needed if we really mean to set as targets investment, growth, and reducing unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Never a heavily indebted country has been able to recover and grow through additional debts and deficits. A successful completion of the debt restructuring will impact a 40 or even more decline of our debt to GDP ratio. The new midterm program, the new loan agreement, and the recapitalization of banks will give our banking system and our economy higher liquidity and more confidence. By mid-March, stabilization and growth will be significantly facilitated. In view also of the broader uncertainties in the Eurozone, our determination to reach these agreements on time will be decisive. Delays in this process may have disproportionate risks. I am convinced that the negotiations will be completed, that the political forces in Greece will be committed to the changes which have to complement the PSI, and that our efforts will have the support of Europe and the IMF. On reforms. For more than 3 decades, we subtracted wealth from our future in the aim to enjoy a wealthier life at that time. Reforms and changes have been pushed aside. This future is now present. Today, we are face to face with our choices of the past, and we discover that we have to pay a huge bill. Besides our own choices, debts and the world financial system have been the central mechanism of this process. Obviously, we were not alone in this course. The debt-to-GDP ratio increased between the mid-70s and today by 130 percentage points for Greece and by 60 percentage points for the US and the European countries. The crisis brought this strategy to its limits. Now, we realize that we lack appropriate drivers of growth and we need to change. Hence, we have to decide how we want to proceed within these new realities. I said that consolidation is the most crucial challenge of the government. Why? Because it is a precondition to exit the crisis. It is a precondition for many other developments. However, in the medium or in the long term, the success of consolidation policies will be co-determined by our capacity to generate growth and to follow consistent and targeted policies and reforms. For this reason, the government is committed to accomplish a range of significant changes of reforms. The areas in question concern the improvement of the business environment, the improved functioning of the judicial system, the introduction of competition in protected services and the liberalization of professions, the reform of the public administration and a new tax system. For the 3 first issues, a draft law has been discussed in the Cabinet. Besides these issues, the reforms of the labour market and the pension system are also under discussion in the aim to find a consensus. On competitiveness. I stress the question of growth because growth is the most popular issue in our public rhetoric. Everybody speaks about growth with the highest certainty. What, however, is not popular at all is that to generate growth, we have to rely on Schumpeter and not on Keynes. I mean that in order to enhance our weak competitiveness, we have to concentrate mainly on how to enhance production and less on how to boost demand. To strengthen competitiveness, we need a strong willingness of both the state and the business sector to modernize production structures, to enhance productivity, to broaden our economy with new types of products and services, to introduce organizational, institutional, and qualitative changes, to make internal functional improvements in enterprises, to save energy or other inputs. Export figures indicate that during the crisis, a range of firms succeeded to increase their export orientation, and this is a promising message. Nevertheless, Greece, following Iceland, still holds the second worst external deficit in the whole OECD area. Many people believe that Greece needs to embark into expansionary policies in the aim to generate growth. This is a dangerous and illusionary fiction. Before expansion can be restored, we need to achieve a new macroeconomic balance and to be determined to give solutions to our weaknesses. For most, we need to abandon many stereotypes, fallacies, and our refusal to understand how to generate stable and sustainable welfare in the present world. The need for competitiveness and growth raises again the question of structural reforms. It is striking that reforms which will improve competitiveness and hence lower the pressure on wages, I could mention, for instance, the liberalization of transport services, are opposed from the same groups that refuse any discussion on labour market issues. There is no consideration that lower cost of non-wage factors is actually in favor of wages, employment, and growth. In this respect, we should bear in mind the impact of the exchange rate fluctuations on competitiveness. A country like Greece can try to enhance its competitiveness through cost-cutting policies. However, a fluctuation of the euro at the order of, let's say, plus minus 15 to 20% within some months might eliminate or might enhance, but it could eliminate any positive impact of, e.g., a restrictive wage policy or other cut-costing strategies. This is a complex problem which is not easy to solve, but it is necessary to take into consideration when we discuss competitiveness and labor cost issues. I cannot enter into the details of all necessary reforms for enhancing competitiveness and growth. I would like, however, to underline that there is one structural reform which will determine the success of all other ones: our capability to change our minds, to adopt a flexible approach against challenges, and to act pragmatically. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude this speech by acknowledging that I am looking to our perspectives with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I am confident that the government will conclude successfully the tasks it has been assigned last November. On the other hand, I firmly believe that the day after this government resigns, we need desperately to deepen reforms and structural changes and to tackle some of the most significant deficiencies which brought us here and continue to impede development and growth. I could mention as examples the creation of an efficient and just tax system, an efficient public administration, an efficient education system, appropriate and functioning institutions, and a performing democracy. On all these issues, however, I am much less confident. Of course, I see significant social forces which are ready to fight for a better future of our country. However, I also see numerous voices who sell nightmare visions as credible perspectives. I see strong political and social forces which for decades resisted any reform to continue to prey the same bankrupt concepts which brought our social cohesion and our economy into their knees. I will conclude with two final remarks. The crisis in Greece was the outcome of the combination of long-term endogenous processes, national behaviors and choices, and of medium-term harmful decisions and choices during the more recent period. Our crisis is an own-made crisis, and we have the responsibility to understand what went wrong and to change what went wrong. Second remark, the crisis was aggravated by short-sighted policies and reactions at the euro level, which failed to recognize that the Greek crisis was the beginning of a wider one, and that it was extremely necessary to react quickly, sufficiently, and preventively in the aim to constrain contagion into the Eurozone. I'm making these remarks because I would like to stress two issues. Firstly, that it's time to understand that if we refuse to be pragmatic, we will again be losers. But secondly, that the success of our efforts depends not only on us, but also on Eurozone strategies. After 3 years of trial and error and of a quite unstable environment, the European leadership needs to grab the opportunity to bring the Euro project and the European project into a more confident course. This would benefit Europe, its member countries, and the world system itself. Thank you for your attention.
And now I will invite you to participate in the discussion and the debate. Few rules. We are not going to accept statements. There are a lot of statements. Only questions. Identify yourself and ask the question, and the people on the panel will answer. Can I have any questions, please? Luca Caccelli.
Thank you very much. Luca Caccelli, a member of parliament, an ex-minister. I start from a question for Daniel Gros and Lord Malloch-Brown. I agree with what Daniel said to start with, that this was a confidence crisis. Question is, if this is a confidence crisis, do you see that in a no-growth environment, this confidence crisis can be resolved? And wouldn't that need a coordinated expansion at the European level, if not at the G20 level? When we have macro adjustments and imbalances, we know that you need a resolution of these imbalances and a coordination somewhere. And this is my question to Lord Mark Malloch-Brown. What are the prospects of such a coordination? How can we move from the present-day cacophony to a coordinated and a common view about resolving the European crisis? And a second question. The adjustment that has taken place in Greece over the past 2 years has been enormous. You've had a reduction in the deficits from 16% to 9% of GDP. Wages have fallen by 15%. Pensions have been cut by a third. The question is, the real exchange rate has improved, competitiveness has improved. A euro falling would help tremendously, it hasn't fallen. And productivity increases would help tremendously, and I would agree with what Tassos Giannitsis said, that you need structural reforms. But as Daniel Gros said, it took 10 years in Germany. What are the limits, both economic and politically, for producing an adjustment in 2 years if you do not have the financial resources to do so and to have successes? Thank you.
Daniel, do you want to start?
Difficult questions. You said, my analysis was that we have a confidence crisis within the Eurozone. Savings in the north, no confidence in the south. What do we do? Of course, it would be nice if we could get back to the old growth model, but that is precluded. Right? That model had its limitations, basically in the accumulation of debt in Southern Europe, and stop. We all know what is desirable. What is desirable is that the northern part of Europe consumes more and invests more. The problem is between what is desirable and what is feasible. There's a large difference. And I doubt very much that we have any button to push which would say, in Germany, people consume more. We have tried that for 50 years. It has never worked much. And therefore, I'm a bit skeptical whether there is something that we can do about the growth model in Germany to have it changed. So I think the only thing we can do is to say we have to change the model of growth in Southern Europe. Not the growth rate, which we cannot push a button to get up, but the model. And that model, again, I think is very little governments can do. It's not a button that you push, but it's something that happens. Jean mentioned earlier the case of Ireland, where things happened because the market worked, there was a labor market, and there was this collective action. People could get together and say, okay, we have seen the limits of what our country can bear, let's agree on a wage cut. You mentioned that wages have been cut in Greece 15%. Now, my figures are a bit different. I don't know. But I just look at the current account as the basic indicator. And that for Greece is still not in equilibrium. And that indicates to me that you're not in a situation yet where growth can start again. The French have a saying which is reculer pour mieux sauter. So you take first a step backwards and then you can jump forward. I think we are not there yet in the case of Greece, unfortunately, and somehow uniting growth with more government expenditure, I don't think is possible at this stage.
Jean.
Just to follow up on Daniel's previous scenario of a weaker euro, what does it mean internally? It means that those countries that are already at a low unemployment rate, close to full employment, and that exporting, mainly Germany, will see additional demands for the products, will therefore see a tighter labor market, and therefore will see wage rising and prices rising. What does it imply? Inflation above 2% in Northern Europe. Is it desirable, and is it compatible with the rule of the game? Yes. The mandate of the ECB is 2% inflation in the euro area on average. And what is desirable for the years to come is more than 2% in Northern Europe, less than 2% in Southern Europe. And that's the adjustment we need. Now, this has to be accepted. This has to be accepted by the ECB, but it is its mandate. This has to be accepted by public opinion and politicians in Northern Europe. And someone should tell them that it's the rule of the game. Now, Jean-Claude Trichet, in one of his last statements, said, we have delivered 1.5 inflation in Germany. I wish that Mario Draghi will not deliver 1.5 inflation in Germany, because that would be a failure for the euro area.
Mark.
Well, on the point of coordination, I think coordination effectively comes when people are walking in the same direction. And that means from the street or square up through the Prime Minister's office or Chancery. And I think for me, one of the most important things tonight was our two Greek colleagues on the panel, the extraordinary sort of self-awareness of the issues that Greece needs to address. And I really congratulate you both for the kind of firmness of your vision on that. And I hope we see similar sort of self-awareness and leadership across Europe, because as was also said, this is a moment when there is a dangerous descent into national stereotypes, in our popular presses and in our parliaments. Germans taking pot shots at Greeks, Greeks taking pot shots at Germans, Brits taking pot shots at French, and vice versa. This is, I grew up in Britain, so I'm used to it. Our press has always done it. But, it is an extreme and demeaning and denigrating of the European ideal, which is that we are one. And we jeopardize and throw that aside, at our peril. We love our diversity, but we're able to sort of pull together in the same direction for our economic and political destiny. And we won't get coordination unless we can recover to that point where we respect each other as countries who each in our own way are trying to grapple with our manifestation of the problem, less severe or more severe as it might be. And coordination kind of comes out of that. It's not something imposed from the top by a class of sort of Olympian bureaucrats who can suddenly somehow do it without the political will beneath it. And so I think we've got a ways to go. And I just one last point. I think the other reason we have a ways to go is that we've talked a lot about the Europe problem as and whether Greece is just a kind of leader and first manifestation, and whether it's a more extreme internal dislocation between North and South of Europe. We've talked less about the fact that the Euro crisis is a reflection of a massive dislocation and reallocation of wealth on a global scale. This is the phenomenon of globalization. This is the phenomenon of the shift of economic power towards the countries of Asia. And unless we kind of grip that too, and as Europe responds sensibly to that, to win back competitiveness, but recognize the changed global context in which we're operating, we again are not going to get to a point of a coherent solution to this.
I would like to add a few questions. First to Dimitris Daskalopoulos. what would be the specific reforms that we urgently need for the recovery of the Greek economy at this stage, so we can avoid default?
Well, specific reforms. I mean, traditional behavior in Greece says that representatives of groups and interest groups should always have a list and make a big fuss about it. And, we do. But, let me make a point right now. These reforms and the changes that are needed in Greece, they are well known. For years, they have been on the pre-election programs of many different political parties. They have been announced in Parliament as the program of many different governments. They have been discussed with our lenders and European partners. They are part of the memorandum. There's a 200-page list. There's a due date for each one of them. I mean, nobody can claim that we don't know what to do or that we need to discuss more what to do. I mean, all we have to do is to do and implement and achieve results. Of course, if I say a few things, since we are all here important in pushing any decisions that are being made in this country, I say, okay, we have the obvious PSI and the loan agreement, which is, I repeat, especially to the media, it is not a receipt for receiving money. It is a 3-year program with actions. And we are not discussing this enough in this country today, and it's only in 3 weeks or 4 weeks that we will have to finalize it. Beyond those that are obvious, I think we have a unique opportunity now, very important for Greece. Europe has said that sooner or later we're going to budgetary convergence, fiscal convergence, so we all need to pass a law, the golden rule of zero deficits. I mean, for Greece, it would greatly benefit it to be one of the first to adopt it. And in the meantime, maybe, as we see that the predominant problem in Greece is unchecked public spending. It keeps, we collect more taxes to pay, and then we need even more taxes to pay the new higher public spending deficit. Maybe we should think right now of adopting a limit on a percentage limit on wage and pension public expenditure as a percent of each year's GDP. It's a good incentive for everybody to work for a higher GDP. On the tax front, I say again, effectively tackle tax evasion and simplify the tax system. That's a promise. I hope we start working on it soon. And above all, I think we must diligently work to create an open economy and a visibly business-friendly environment. That is the main reason that we have not had FDI, foreign direct investment, in the years, and nobody's touching us now, and even Greek businesses are staying away. When this suffocating problem of the government debt and the fiscal problem of the country goes away, and with it, when uncertainty goes away, I think business is ready to lead the way back to growth and prosperity. And it is now that we should act to prepare the environment that is favorable for this. And at a minimum, again, I say the obvious things. What we need is liberalizing all the markets and the professions and opening them to competition. Finalize all this issue about zoning laws, land use, environmental licensing for businesses. And small little things like taking away the little obstacles that take out so much of the energy of business people or people who are trying to create something on a daily basis. I mean, our federation made, 14 months ago, a list of 250 of these, of which we prioritized 30. It was part of the memorandum. I think about 7% of them has been adopted. And we also commissioned a study by McKinsey, which is ready. It is a report with 100 specific recommendations about what we should do horizontally and what can business do in specific sectors. I mean, let's read those things and let's go do them.
The Honorable Ambassador of Netherlands. Microphone.
Sorry, can I do that? Thank you very much for a most rewarding evening with very good interventions. I would have a remark, or well, rather a question, on the importance of social dialogue between social partners. I'm from a country where that is absolutely key to the success that my country has had in generating economic growth, becoming a big exporting country. That is the continuous structural dialogue between government and the social partners, mainly the Employers' Federation of the Netherlands and the different trade unions, to agree on the broad parameters, the broad outlines of where you create sustainable growth, but also how you make compromises. Because doing all the things, in particular what Mr. Daskalopoulos said, the long lists of specific actions that to be taken can only work in complex societies such as Greece, but also a complex society as my own, where you have continuously to make coalitions and where you need to create support, and not just political support, but support that is really carried by everybody who has a job or has an activity. And we do that through the organized social dialogue. What are the chances that in this specific crisis can really take off in Greece? Thank you.
The fact that you have diplomatic immunity allowed you to make the statement. Mark.
I'm not sure I can answer for Greece, and there may be, I think, others much better qualified than I, but I mean, I think the point, Ambassador, is absolutely correct. When it is a matter of sharing out the pain, the dialogue between different groups to arrive at as broad a consensus as possible. I think only in such a sensible place as the Netherlands do you all agree. But nevertheless, you can drive a broad consensus. But I think it is not just a social dialogue. It comes back to a point I made earlier about, you know, also the powerful political narrative, because, and it's why I'm wary of resting this whole thing on saving the euro and membership of it. I just think that is so discredited for so many people that you've got to bring it back to the values of saving the European idea, which, and if under that you can cascade down to a social dialogue, then I think you have a real opportunity of healing where at the moment the debate about the euro divides.
Minister Giannitsis.
My answer is that the social dialogue is a very substantial element of and mechanism in a real democracy. So having said that, I think we have to distinguish the formal and the substantial function of the social dialogue. The substantial dimension and function of the social dialogue is to bridge differences, to make compromises, to bring the different social partners in a situation to understand each other's problems and interests, and through a difficult or a less difficult procedure to achieve some consensus or a consensus in order to solve problems. Social dialogue proved to be a very important instrument for a range of countries, especially European countries, perhaps also other countries elsewhere. On the other side, exactly because the social dialogue proved to be an efficient instrument for development and evolution and social democracy in those countries, it has become a formal instrument which could not be ignored in other countries. So we have to distinguish if social dialogue is used and is an instrument, but the difference is that if one looks at the social dialogue in a formal way, this means that compromises cannot be achieved, differences cannot be breached. Social dialogue is used just as formally to see or to show that we are here and we discuss, but really discussion is not taking place, concessions or compromises are not made, and consensus cannot be reached. So I would say that the effectiveness of social dialogue is a question of culture and of history of each society. And if I should position Greece as I can suppose you expect from me to do, I would say that we are somewhere in the middle, where social dialogue is not yet such an effective and efficient instrument to solve social problems and issues, but I hope that we are in somewhere meeting the road to succeed. Now, what will be the result in these days from different social dialogues which are taking place? I am also curious to see, as you.
This question goes to Daniel Gros and Jean Pisani-Ferry. Few of the Anglo-Saxon economists lately, they are saying that through the devaluation of a new currency like drachma, we can achieve competitiveness. And in your paper, Daniel, you said that they are not calculating correctly the transaction costs and the damage for going to drachma. Can you please elaborate?
Devaluation or exit from the euro and then devaluation is of course perceived by many to be an easy way out. Fundamentally, it doesn't change anything in the sense that, what I said earlier, you need to have your wages to become competitive, first at the very low productivity level you have today, and then hopefully through the structural reforms, from then on forwards, your productivity level goes up quicker than beforehand, and then you can recover. What devaluation or exit from the euro does, and that is different from a country with a currency, is that it adds to the shock of just the new relative price, the shock basically of breaking down the financial system. So the recovery from the shock will, at least initially, be even more difficult. Banks won't work, foreign contractors won't accept your currency, so the very act of exporting will become more difficult, and I wouldn't be surprised that one immediate reaction to an exit from the euro would be first a fall in exports, because mechanically and in terms of the transaction costs, it would become more difficult. So my view would be that's not an easy or cheap way out.
Jean.
Well, I do agree with Daniel. I think not only in Greece, in other countries, there are people pretending that the easy way out would be would be to introduce national currency. And from the point of view of the adjustment of relative prices, it is true that it's a bit, this comparison between changing your clock for winter time versus summer time, or having to change everyone's habit of getting to work earlier or later. I mean, there's a coordination function when you change a clock that suddenly makes the adjustment for everybody. Now, that's true, and that's would be the benefit of going to a new currency. But the cost would be that, first of all, this financial integration that we have at present has been a big success of the euro. I mean, we're forgetting that one field in which the euro has been extremely successful is in fostering financial integration to a degree not seen before. On average, each euro area country holds 100% of its GDP in foreign assets and has 100% of its GDP in foreign liabilities vis-à-vis the other euro for the euro area, if it's a breakup of the euro area, or for countries making that choice. So I think it's a bit of an easy talk to consider only the flow component and not the stock component of this kind of choice. Now let me also make a point in response to what Mark was repeatedly saying, that the euro may not be such a great idea after all, but Europe is a great idea, so we have to focus on Europe and perhaps not so much on the euro in the discussion about that, if I interpret it correctly. I'm not sure I agree. I think the appetite for Europe is in many countries today limited. So I'm not sure that it's going to be very convincing to say, let's focus on Europe, and by the way, this implies the euro. I think the citizens realize, and I think the polls are clear in several countries, that maybe they're having second thought about the wisdom of entering the euro, but they realize very well that to leave it would be a huge cost. I mean, in my country, that's very clear. I mean, when you ask people, was it a good idea, they say majority or close to majority, they say no, but should we leave? They say no by a vast majority, because people realize that, we're in it, and that's the reality. So I think the focus should be on repairing what is not working, because it's an investment we made, and it's not an investment for 10 years. I mean, I think it was wrong to say after 5 years the euro is a big success. It is wrong after 10 years to say the euro is a big failure, because it's an investment for a much longer time horizon. It's an investment also in, for internal reasons, for external reasons, for also for being the provider of an international currency. That's something that needs to be assessed in a much longer term horizon. So our task today is to make it work. And I think that's where we should focus on.
Ambassador.
Starting from the last sentence, Professor Pisani referred to Tommaso Scopa's difference between weak and limited power. Taking into consideration, my question is that taking into consideration that we have a common currency and a common monetary system, but national control of fiscal policy, finance and banking, and taking into consideration too that we do not have today the adequate political mechanisms required to manage the Eurozone economy. Isn't exactly this weak moment for starting the strengthening of the European institutions in this field in order not to fall into an intergovernmental model? Thank you.
Jean.
Yeah, that's the reason why I mentioned him. I mean, his sentence, because I think this corresponds to the moment we're in. I mean, the euro was created at a time where there was already limited appetite for further integration. So the choice was made to do kind of bare-bone EMU, the minimum requirements to create a common currency. It meant especially nothing at all in the budgetary field except the requirement for discipline. It meant nothing in the field of financial integration except free capital flows. And the architect, I think, the people who initiated it, Tommaso was among them, thought this would create a momentum. The euro would create a momentum, and there would be further decisions down the road. Now, the mistake they made is that it created the opposite of a momentum, that governments said, we have conceded so much to the EU level, the currency, it's a big concession, let's keep everything else for us, and let's resist any form of additional transfer of sovereignty. So we built this integrated financial system, but refused entirely to consider that, having pan-European banks at some point was bound to mean having pan-European supervision, and having pan-European banks were bound to meet at some point having common responsibility for rescuing those banks because they were becoming too big for a single country. And that was rejected, and it's still rejected. So I think that's really what we need to do. In the field of financial integration, I think that in the fiscal field, that's a question of Eurobond, as I said. And all that is only possible also if there is a degree of political integration that goes with it. So I think it's exactly this moment when we realize that the euro, in fact, is incomplete, that this bare-bone approach to EMU does not work, and that we have to go for something more. Now, I would keep this, the mantra of Tommaso. It's not the opportunity to realize whatever dream people may have about European integration. It's not the opportunity to just to use it as a Christmas tree to add whatever you want to add. You have to be disciplined. You have to add what is required to make it work. And that's a hard work to do. And don't take this opportunity to go beyond. Just do the hard work.
Mark.
Yes, let me just say, and it also answers the point of, am I saying don't fight for the euro or not? I'm a student of the United Nations, and the origins of the United Nations were the Allies in a very tough bind in the Second World War, and looking for a bigger cause in which to frame the sacrifices that people were making, and hence the concept of the United Nations. And I feel very similarly today about Europe. It's very hard to ask people to go on sacrificing their lifestyles and jobs and pensions for something called the euro. That is a war of attrition that you finally lose. And it goes to the point that given the Europe we have now is a Europe by stealth, which was intended to build its own momentum to build itself, surely now is the time to come clean on the European project, not necessarily a blanket endorsement of the dysfunctional Brussels and its institutions that have grown up, but a vision for renewal which makes sense to young Europeans, which is about an open Europe in an open world, and which is about us fighting for our place and our values in that world. So I'm not saying junk the euro, not at all, but I'm saying let's choose our battle and let's make it the big battle of the kind of world we believe in and the kind of Europe that can fight for that world.
My next question is for Minister Giannitsis. The national unity government you are part of, and an important one, is having a full series of reforms for the economy and the state. Does it have enough time to implement these reforms?
Stelios, allow me first to add a remark on an issue which was discussed previously, that is devaluation, because I think there's an element which it's necessary to mention when we speak about devaluation in the case of Greece and not in general. What is important to remember is that about 70 or 65% of the inputs of the Greek production, especially production in trade-related goods, comes from abroad. And this means that a devaluation will automatically diminish the competitiveness at least by 65% of the gain one could have through the devaluation. The devaluations which we experienced in the past have achieved, were successful, or they failed, not by themselves, but because of the complementary measures which have been introduced, and always you have to introduce such measures, which mean very restrictive wage policies, very restrictive fiscal policies, and a lot of other measures. So we should not think of devaluation as being the magic instrument to solve problems of competitiveness. Of course, as I said, it is a problem if, for instance, Greece, Portugal, or any other country make efforts to take the example of wage cuts to diminish wages, as was said, by 15 or 20%, and you have in the next few months a revaluation of about 20%. What is then who can discuss then about competitiveness and who is responsible and in what you can do? I don't have a solution for that, but I think that there is a problem, there is a problem. Now, you said about the question, the very difficult question about the timing of this government. The government is the result of a political decision, of a political agreement among different parties, 3 parties. It's supported also by a fourth party. I think that, of course, there is no time within the limited discussed period till spring or something like that to accomplish all these reforms, but one can hope that we can start to introduce reforms or to prepare reforms and to pose the agenda for the next government. We cannot, it is politically and democratically inappropriate to discuss a further term of this government, even if the society or parts of the society or even we would like and would think that it would be useful and efficient and beneficial for the country. What I think is crucial, and I mentioned it in my intervention, is that this government can become a paradigm how a next government or next governments should function, and what the targets of the next era of governance of Greece should be. Thank you.
I would like to thank our panelists, but most importantly, I would like to thank the impressive and amazing audience tonight for joining us in these critical moments, and I hope by the end of these presentations and debate, you might get out of this room hopefully with some answers, more questions, but hopefully with more hope. Thank you very much.